Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the editor chat on data preservation and transparency. My name is Randy Townsend, Director of Publication Operations at AGU. AGU's data requirements state that data supporting your research and visualizations in your paper must be in a trusted repository that supports the FAIR principles. That means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. The application of these requirements brings a variety of challenges for authors, reviewers, and editors. Joining me today to discuss some of these challenges are 4 editors from AGU journals. Please welcome Ankur Desai and Debbie Huntsinger from JGR Biogeosciences, Mike Hapgood from Space Weather, and Olga from JGR Earth Surface. There will be a Q&A after the discussion, so please add questions in the chat. I would also mention that AGU staff, including Shelley Stahl, Senior Director of Data Leadership at AGU, will be monitoring the chat and helping to respond to some of the questions. So my first question is for Olga. And I want to kind of start from the beginning. We have a variety of people from at different stages in their careers joining us. So on a fundamental level, why should I, as an author, put my data in a repository?
Well, it's a very good question, Randy, of course, because you can hold your data and then be like the only person who has it and respond to requests. But on a very fundamental level, what as a researcher, either at early stage or later, you would really want to have that people have confidence in your publication, and that confidence comes with reproducibility. It's one aspect why one would want to have data publicly accessible, and obviously for obvious reason, again, for any person at any stages of their career, you want to promote your research. And fundamentally, if your data are easily searchable and publicly available, that means application support will be cited and read as well, meaning you make a much bigger promotion and have much bigger audience of your publication, not only to a person who happened to find your publication and read it, but via data that would allow to discover your work, your research. And of course, you can such things can lead to further collaborations, interdisciplinary, for instance, or even within the same discipline, having much broader impact and collaboration.
Great. Thanks, Olga. And your bandwidth is going, your network is going a little bit in and out. So you may want to turn your camera
Okay,
on.
then I'll probably just put my camera. Yeah, I'll choose. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ankur, um, another thing that we hear from authors, it's think about the data as this is my data. So a question that I would, if I put myself in the position of an author that feels as though this is my data, I'm going to claw onto it. I'll tell you what I did, but I'm not going to give you what I did. Why are you making me do this now when I'm trying to publish my work?
Sorry there, I had to unmute. Randy, that's a great question. And let me just start by saying, I feel you all authors, like it is an additional burden, right? To have to gather your data, find a place to put it, organize it, and all of this in advance while you're still excited to want to get your paper out. And you're also worried about, well, if I put this data out there, what's going to happen to it? And my simple take on this is that the data is part of the story of your paper. And it's part of the story that allows people to be able to understand what you did, to be able to replicate your results, right? And to be able to say that, yes, what you did makes sense. And for people to be able to take that, work with that data and collaborate in the future on ways that you can extend your research. And in fact, I've been sharing my data for a long period of time. And what I found is that the likelihood that has led to new collaborations and new ways to look at my data have been far, far greater than any concerns or challenges I've had with people using my data without attribution, which tends to, I think, we tend to over worry about that, I think. Part of the reason of asking for the data ahead of time at the time of submission is really for an opportunity for the editors and the reviewers to also have an opportunity to give you feedback, not just on the scientific content of your paper, but also on, is the data repository sufficient and worthwhile, including the data necessary for a reader to be able to, say, reproduce your results. And it's completely fair, as noted in our data policy, for that data submission to reviewers to be, in a temporary location, a different location than the final one that you might provide on acceptance, which needs to preferably follow all the FAIR principles and all that stuff. And of course, if it's a real challenge, or if you're really concerned about something, or if there is some sort of proprietary nature of it, you can always reach out to publications and to the editors and describe your case. We're not trying to prevent you from publishing your papers. We're trying to make sure that we get the data, because what the reality is, even for journals that have data statements, if we wait till acceptance, the vast majority, a lot of authors will not submit their data. It will not necessarily include what we need. The vast majority of published papers out there, it is nearly impossible to get their data. I think something like 85% of papers published in the last 12 months in this one study, where they had contact by author for data, were unable to get the data, or the authors could not find the data. So it also benefits you.
Great, and thank you, Ankur. And if any of the other editors want to weigh in on any of these questions, feel free to kind of jump in. Mike, the next question I actually have is for you, and I picked you particularly because I think for your particular journal, Space Weather, and not just your journal, but in your journal, you kind of run into these scenarios more frequently than maybe some of our other journals. But my question for you is, me as a researcher, my data was made available to me for my research with conditions from the data owner. It could have been proprietary data. There could have been a non-disclosure agreement in place. Does that mean I cannot publish with AGU? And what recommendations do you have for me to satisfy the requirements to publish at AGU?
Okay, the simple answer, of course, is talk to the editor. And with papers like that, we spend a lot of time working with the authors and maybe them trying to go back to their contacts. And there's often ways around it. First of all, if the data is actually being published in the paper as a graph, one thing I would do is look, could you actually get the data just by reverse engineering the graph, and then try and use that as an argument to encourage publication of the data. An important tool, and this is starting to borrow ideas from life sciences, is data anonymization. So we don't necessarily want to publish the full details of data, just enough to support the paper. So for instance, Space Weather, we're talking about faults, especially causing problems for something like the power grid or whatever. So it's fine to classify the faults, and then just publish the numbers of just what the types of faults that have occurred, but you can't get the details. I think the power companies didn't want to release their detailed logs, and that's fair enough. But that's exactly the same as in life sciences, where you anonymize, you make sure your data can't identify particular individuals who had some health conditions. So we're trying to learn from that discipline. In the long run, I think the ultimate thing is we want to publish good science. We work with the authors and try and find the best solution we can. I should also add, actually, in some cases, of course, there's a legal constraint beyond the proprietary thing that we can't publish it. In the US in particular, some of the power grid data we would like to see is actually restricted by regulations from your Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. So, if there's a law there, then we obey the law. That's quite simple.
Great. Does anybody else want to add to that before I move on to the next question?
I could make a quick comment if you want. This is Amy East with
Oh, sure.
GGR Earth Surface. One situation that we do sometimes run into with proprietary data is the use of industry data that was collected through the oil and gas industry, and the authors may be using it to make geologic interpretations of the subsurface from geophysical data. And we understand that most commonly those data cannot be released. But the question that we use in evaluating whether we can still proceed with the paper is just, is seeing the original data necessary to interpret the validity of the author's geologic interpretations? If you can't tell how they got their interpretation or whether their interpretation is robust and accurate without seeing the original data, that would be a problem. But in many cases, that's not necessary. In many cases, you can see from the seismic data whether their interpretation looks reasonable without seeing the original data files. And we have proceeded toward publication without the original data being released and without location data for those data being released, which is fine.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for joining us. Ankur?
Yeah, I mean, I would also say you can also use this as an opportunity, right, to potentially push your data provider to think about why it's important to put their data in permanent long-term repositories and why it's important to share from the perspective of open science. For my case, for example, I do a lot of co-publishing, co-authoring with authors in other countries where they may have different cultural barriers to wanting to share data, or there may be kind of hierarchies that prevent them from doing that. And often, say, hey, the journal's got this strong data policy, and if we really want to get this paper in this really good AGU journal, we're going to have to do something for the data. And that might actually help change the conversation you're having with that group of researchers who may have traditionally been reticent about sharing, but may actually be more open to it. And that helps the entire scientific community.
Can I come in at just a slightly counterpoint to that? I agree with everything you're saying, but also we have to be sometimes aware that we're working with industry people. They're worried that basically they're going to run into conspiracy theorists who will abuse the data to blame them for something that makes absolute nonsense. And so again, we need to sort of develop a rapport with industry data providers that the data will be used responsibly. So sometimes we may have to involve a gatekeeper in access to the data.
Yep, and that's a fair point.
This kind of makes me think too, before we had the FAIR principles being developed and we weren't making these recommendations, there was a degree of trust that kind of went in. I think it was almost unwritten that, this particular person is a trusted person and their research can be trusted. Speak a little bit about what these requirements mean to those kinds of understandings. I guess they were kind of unwritten rules. It's kind of a tradition. We're changing the cultural landscape right now with these requirements and these expectations. Can you speak to somebody that is has been doing research for decades, and now we're suddenly saying, please put your data in a repository? And I'll just open that up to anyone that may want to speak.
Somebody who has been doing research for rather too many decades, I don't see people being it being an age thing. I think it's more a personality thing. There are plenty of people who've actually retired who are busy knocking out data and putting things online. So I think it's down to individuals rather than trying to put it into some classification, other classification.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of the resistance is that it's work, right? It takes time and effort, and you spent all this time writing this paper, and then and if your lab is anything like mine, yeah, we're very careful about our data and we document it well, but actually putting it into like a coherent repository with metadata and instructions and any of these caveats so that people don't incorrectly use the data, that's time and effort. And I think more than anything, it's really the that often is a barrier more than anything. And I do agree, like that and part of the reason of making data submission required at submission is kind of to make sure that that discussion is starting early enough, not like, oh crap, my paper's accepted and now I got to figure out how to get this data, and the repository may have requirements and you may have to like fill out a sheet and it might take a few weeks to get the DOI and all that kind of stuff. So that's one thing I've seen. I mean, I'm completely, you know, somebody who's been in that boat and been like, oh, you know, especially with some of these data sets I work with that can be terabytes in size, it's not straightforward to archive that kind of data.
Isn't that an issue about resources too? And it depends whether you have a funding agency that recognizes they should provide you with resources to handle the data. And I think if you're being funded through an environmental science orientated agency, that's often the case. But other agencies, or maybe I shouldn't name any names, or classic, but they may be more resistant. Oh, you've used your data, you don't need it again, throw it away. And you still run into that with people come from some other disciplines outside the geosciences.
Randy, can I add a little bit?
Sure, Shelley. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. And Ankur's point about the fact that it's really not straightforward, and Mike's point about how it's still very difficult depending on the type of data to share, those are all very real problems. But your point about trust, Randy, I trust my colleague, I trust my lab partner, I trust the people I've worked with before. I put in the chat an article by Peter Brewer, who just concluded his tenure as editor-in-chief for JGR Oceans, and he wrote this fantastic retrospective on the challenges that he had by contacting his own friends to find the data he needed for this analysis. I think it was had to do with oxygen within the ocean that he was trying to determine. And each of the data points he was looking for, he says, listen, there was just one or two from each of these other papers, but getting that information was so difficult. And he actually failed in one point. And in the article, he also shows that there was a problem with one of the files that came from a friend. And the postdoc who was responsible for the data was no longer available, and it looked like the X and Y axis were flipped. And there's no way to fix that. There's no way to have a conversation and deal with that, because they didn't take the time to actually put that information into a repository and walk through a basic curation process. So his article is one of my favorite to share, and I think that really goes towards why we want to preserve the data.
Thank you, and thank you for dropping the link into the chat. I've seen Amy East pop back in. Amy, did you want to mention something?
Oh, I'm just saying hello.
Oh.
I add a little bit, so I keep my camera off just for the bandwidth reasons. Yes, it's absolutely true what has been said, and it's also true that the mental set that data are part of the publication. It is, and the whole thing is an integral part. So it's much easier to discover that bit if it is somewhere in a repository and curated and maintained, and all those files are maintained in a good shape, they do not crash. There are no issues with incompatibilities of software, and so just to make sure the longevity of those data sets and somebody else who takes care. Unfortunately, at the very beginning, when the data have to be submitted to repositories and everything, yes, it is a lot of work and effort. But beyond that, it's somebody else's problem, if you wish. So you put that repositories maintain it, and people, you can just refer to those locations and repositories for anybody who wants to use it. Kind of responding to requests about your paper from 15, 20 years ago, asking what was that number that you showed in your file. It's, again, even more effort that you put yourself up like for many, many years to come. So yes, effectively, this is more like culture, not necessarily cultural, but the idea that data have to be shared needs to be part of a routine or a publication routine, publishing routine. So, and that's what we are trying to do, and in many instances still struggling with that.
I also have, I can add a little bit to this, you know, in terms of what Oba and Ankar said, and yeah, in terms of Ankar, you know, it is work and it takes effort to format and process your data to be acceptable for repositories and provide the appropriate metadata. But more and more we're getting, you know, you can publish that data set and get a DOI. And so you have, it is effort, but there's a return on that effort to some extent. So you have a published data product. So that's kind of one carrot for taking the effort. And then also I agree with the fact that this is an integral part of the work, right? So in terms of evaluating the rigor of an analysis or a paper, the data is critical to that evaluation. And so it needs to be part of the review process, I believe. And then it also aids to you know, transparency and traceability in our work, right? Which I think is becoming more and more of a requirement in science, that we need to, you know, especially when we start to see more misinformation out there, maybe not from respected publications, but in other sources. We want to show that we have, you know, you can trace the results back to the initial data. That it provides integrity to the work.
Debbie makes a really important point, which is the issuing of DOIs and citations for data are actually something that's valuable for early career researchers as well, in that I am now seeing more resumes and CVs with, in addition to publications, data products. And that actually makes me more you know, interested in the candidate as somebody who is careful and archiving their data, and is a way to recognize that in your, you know, within your CV.
Thanks for that. That's a lot of good thing, and Ankur, that's interesting to add this consideration as a part of your determinations. My next question is actually for Debbie, so I'm glad you jumped into that discussion. So from the publications department standpoint, and for the paper, we have you know, certain requirements. So we're looking for a clear statement that expresses how that data are going to be made available and how someone can access it. We ask for a data citation. As an editor, what elements are you looking for in a paper's data statement, and what advice do you give authors during the review most frequently?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that from the get-go, especially when you're submitting to particularly, you know, JGR Biogeosciences or any of the AGU publications, that you include a data statement from the beginning. So when you first submit the manuscript, even if you're in the process of archiving that data. So it's important to include that data statement, and you can make it clear that you're in the process of archiving that data and in what repository. But in terms of the data statement, we're looking for explicitly, you know, here are the data products that are used, and here's how readers can access that data. And so we're looking for a link to that repository, and that's the specific link to that data set. So not just a general link to just, you know, a site, but, you know, how can an author actually, or a reader actually access that particular data product. So a specific link to that data product. If there's a DOI, a data citation as well in the reference cited. If you're, you know, so for each and every data product that is integral to the work that's being presented in the manuscript. And then if you're working with modeled results or code, that's a significant portion of the research, then you would want to, I think at a minimum, include access to those modeled results, and in some cases the source code for that. But that can get a little bit trickier, particularly when you're working with models that maybe you did not, that are not your own. And so, but at least having the output, so the simulation results from those archived somewhere is important. So you basically, and if there's any restrictions on that data, please acknowledge that in the acknowledgement section and state, you know, any licensing restrictions or access restrictions that there might be. But we tend to red flags that go up. We don't want contact author for data. That's a no-no. That's not acceptable. Not archiving data at an FTP site, a personal FTP site is not acceptable, or a personal website. It might be acceptable in the peer review process so that reviewers can access that data, but when that data hits publication, we want it to be archived in a fair, compliant data repository. Also avoiding putting data in a supplementary information or appendix. It's just, if it's in a table form, it's better, it's easier, and it gets trickier there when you're dealing with a really small data set. So there is a gray area on what can be going into supplemental versus what can be archived. But generally just making sure that you have a clear data statement and that those links are functional and that readers and reviewers can access that data and review it.
Do you mind if I add a little bit more to what Debbie said?
Yeah.
So if there's just one data point or 2 data points, those are precious data points and need to get into a repository, even though your mind thinks, you know, that could easily go in the supplement. Don't go there. It's valuable. And if your whole research is based on just a few data points, really important to get that into a repository. So just think about how valuable those are. And the other thing to add on, model data, Debbie's talking about the fact that, you know, data on request is like a no-no. Absolutely. Model data gets really tricky because of its size. And I think it depends, like if you're working with Debbie or if you're working with one of the editors, what is necessary to review that research? Do you need, usually you don't need all the model runs. Usually it's maybe selected model runs. So definitely be in contact with your editor on exactly what would be necessary. Debbie, is that a good way to reflect what you said?
Yeah, particularly like we, in our journal, we deal a lot with maybe, you know, process-based model results or that kind of thing. And yeah, those outputs can be really large, and maybe it's just a few key variables that are important for evaluating the research. So we don't need all variables from the model runs or necessarily all model runs, but it's just making a judgment of, you know, how do I, you know, provide the information needed for others to reproduce my results. And so what would they need to do that? That's what should be archived.
Can I pick up on the modeling a moment? We've had some papers where people have used commercial simulation packages. So what we've encouraged them to do is to publish the essentially initialization or configuration files that they use to drive the models, and then they can refer to what that commercial package is. Because clearly, that's a commercial package that people have to go and buy it. But it's that I think covers that one quite nicely.
And Mike, go ahead, Ankur.
Oh, I was just going to say too that, you know, certainly with data volume, some of the repositories are now cognizant that some data files, whether from model or from observations, can be large, and are working on ways to be able to do that. So for example, recently I had a master's student who ran a weather model, and for the perspective of this specific paper, the actual full 3D model output every 10 seconds was needed to be able to understand and replicate the results. And for my own personal need, I knew this student was going to leave, and I wanted to be able to find this data again, say down the road when I have the next student who wants to actually work with the set. So I actually worked with a repository called the Environmental Data Initiative, and they were actually really helpful. And because transfer was so long, I actually bought a hard drive, put the data on the hard drive, and physically mailed it to them. And so there's some creative solutions that have turned out to be much faster than FTPing the data, US Postal Service for the win. And so there are creative ways in repositories to get large data sets transferred as well.
And if I may jump on that conversation as well, 2 points on large model outputs. Yes, that's what Ankur just said. It's there are very creative ways to solve that, but in many instances, and this is absolutely true in climate models, sometimes it's easier to rerun the model than to store the whole output. That's why all configuration files, they're much smaller. They are like really very, very tiny, but that a full configuration needs to be preserved. And what people usually do, and I'm familiar with that, it's from personal experience. You create a tar file and archive it on Zenodo or any repository with DOI with the frozen configuration of that model configuration that was used, and then it's a working approach to reproduce all data that came along with the publication and described in the publication. It's another kind of approach to deal with that. And in terms of the commercial packages, again, I use one of those personally. My approach to that is to provide a clear description of the model setup and everything that can be reproduced regardless of the package. Either it's an open source or actually everyone uses MATLAB, or it became so ubiquitous that it viewed as the most scientific software, but nevertheless, it is commercial, one has to buy it. So in that regard, describing the model setup in simulations that it can be reproduced with any coding language, that's the way to deal with such problems.
Can I also weigh in on about institutional repositories a moment? Sometimes when I have authors, I will actually go and spy, if they're a particular major university, does their university have a institutional repository? And sometimes just encourage them to start talking with the people there. So it always strikes me as a good way. Then they're talking to some local people who will probably like to encourage them to move this way.
Yeah, and too, thinking about like if your research is funded by NASA or NSF, I know with NASA there's several data repositories out there, and like the ORNL DAC for biogeochemical related results, and so you can archive data there, and oftentimes really large data sets. So it's worthwhile like thinking about the funding agency that supported the work and whether they have an archival setup that can work for the data output.
Actually, just thinking about it, here in the UK, our Natural Environmental Research Council mandates, if you win a proposal and get funding, you have to produce a data management plan. And that includes, where are you going to put the data? So that's why I said before, on the environmental side, and NERC, as they're called here, are now one of the major funders of sort of research in my area, space weather. That's really good now. There's a strong element there, but in other research areas, it's less strong as yet.
And Mike, to that point, I think it makes it easier as an editor when you see papers that come from that area subject to those requirements. How challenging is it, or describe some of the challenges when you get research from other areas that don't have those same requirements?
It's just what I said before. It's very specific to the case. Look at the paper, see what advice you can give. Is the data implicit in the graphs, or are the graphs too complicated to reverse engineer? So if you could reverse engineer it, you can suggest, well, you've effectively published it. There's the data anonymization, which is, I think, I've found really quite useful in a couple of occasions now. So it's adapting to the circumstance. There isn't a single magic formula.
Great. So this next question that I have, I'm going to pose it to everybody, but I'm going to start with Ankur actually, because he mentioned that he's been archiving his data for a while. But I'd love for each of you to share, and Ankur, you first. So one of the important things to recognize is that you all, although you are editors, you're also researchers. You're also in education, or in other areas. So the challenges of archiving data aren't just for the authors; they're also for you. You all have these same challenges. So would you mind describing some of the experiences that you've had and challenges in trying to identify repositories for your own data, and what you've been able to do, what you had to do to overcome some of those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, so I already mentioned a story about the weather model output, and that was one where, you know, in fact, we weren't even, that was submitted to a non-AGU journal where we didn't have the same data requirements, but even still, I felt obligated because it's important from my perspective, right? Otherwise, the only place that model data would live is on my Linux cluster, and potentially on the high performance computer until they decide to get rid of it. And yeah, I mean, I haven't been in my building in 7 months. I don't even know if it's still there. And so the building or the computer. And so there's definitely, you know, some use in just being able to have that. But yeah, it took a conversation, it took emails. I mean, certainly it's a lot easier than when I started out as a grad student. I mean, part of the reason I started sharing data was just because I needed an easy way to access it. And so I just put everything on an HTTP site because it was an easy way to get files. And then people started finding them through search engines. And actually I got invited to a collaboration in Europe as a result of somebody finding a piece of code that was what they needed to solve a problem. And that led to a paper that's one of my highest cited papers. And so it was, you know, those kind of experiences kind of really nudged me to think about that this is actually part of how to do science effectively, right? We all like to work with each other, right? We are, you know, there's very little science that's done by an individual person in a cave. And so there's a lot to be gained. One of the challenges we've been facing recently is in some ways, the data policies have kind of started to migrate into these syntheses and projects and repositories at agencies and so forth. But now we're running into these very nitty-gritty questions about things like data policies and licenses and software license and codes and whether it's Creative Commons this or that. And it is pretty confusing, and there's certain requirements for what attribution means and what citation means and what modification means in the case of code. And that's something that I think is still, you know, I think a lot of us have settled to a couple of these Creative Commons, CC BY4 and whatever type policies and licenses, but it's something that I had never thought about until say like 2 years ago. And it's something that, you know, we end up in these very roundabout arguments occasionally because we don't all fully understand it. So that's something that is kind of a current challenge right now, is making sure that we're picking the right policies which influence, especially for these syntheses data sets where everyone's collecting data and sharing it, like the case in my case, eddy covariance flux tower data, where we're all submitting it to the same repository, the Department of Energy, for public access. That's been a new challenge.
Great, thanks, Ankur. Olga, would you like to share?
Yes. My field of research is cryosphere and glaciology, and there are very specific data repositories dedicated to that. Primarily, it's National Snow and Ice Data Center out of Boulder, Colorado, and maintained there. So, from personal experience, when AGU instituted data policy, it's a few years ago now, what happened, everybody tried to submit their data to NCIDC and they became backlogged. So, and the backlog was about 9-12 months. And with the current requirement of AGU policy that the data are already there by the time of publication, by the time of the acceptance, it was literally impossible. So in that regard, addition of general repositories like Zenodo and FileShare and such, that help. But on the other hand, if people would like their data be found and searchable in these discipline-specific repositories, then they do need to work with the repositories and people and organizations who maintain and support those. So that I think still not fully resolved question. And it's far larger discussion and much higher level discussions who pays for data support and for data management. And yes, we all in the US, for instance, NSF requires data management plans, so it is part of any standard proposal. But the question is still the same: who maintains, who pays for that? And it seems like the prevailing view that it's researchers who are responsible. It starts to change, but the change is not as great, or the rate of that change is not as great. That it's still a work in progress in many things. But in terms of my personal kind of routine in terms of submitting publications and preparing for submission, I do now, before hitting the submit button, I already have files that should go in along with this particular publication, because I know that down the line I'll be asked to do that anyway. So it's much easier while you're still thinking about your current manuscript and you are still fresh in terms of which files where, what variables, how to organize. It's much easier to do it at the time of publication rather than say 6 months after, whatever, although we do try to have the timeline for reviews and everything much shorter, but nevertheless the timeline about 6 months when the your manuscript is accepted and about to be published. You already probably have forgotten many details of all those files and where they are, how to find them, how to submit data and everything. So in that regard, doing everything, although it's much more work, we have already said, it takes a routine, but it's much easier down in the own kind of term perspective if it is done if it is done at the time of submission of your manuscript.
Great. Thanks, Olga. Debbie?
Yeah, so in my research, for about the last 10 years or so, been working with these larger model intercomparison efforts that deals with a lot of model driver data sets and model output. And unfortunately, we had funded in the project, basically a data scientist that works at Oak Ridge National Lab and was fundamental in helping us archive all of those data products at the ORNL DAC. And so one thing I can encourage, thinking about when you're submitting proposals for funding, also including some funding in there for data archival, so processing, getting that data up, whether it's a postdoc or another member of the team, and it depends on the nature of the project and whether that makes sense. But if you know that you're going to be producing some really large data sets, funding upfront, providing funding upfront for those individuals is important. And then Encore mentioned data policy. We struggled with that because this is a large effort with a lot of collaborators. We want to make sure that their effort is acknowledged. And so having data policies that acknowledge their contribution to that data product, not only in the DOI, the data citation, but also in the use of that data product. So you can have it freely available, but with the stipulation that, you know, the authors of that data product may be invited to be co-authors on manuscripts where those products are used, for example. And so having a data policy, I think, if you're having a larger collaborative group, making sure that individuals are getting acknowledged for the effort of producing that data product. And then, you know, I do also agree that there's just, I think Ankur mentioned this, that we've seen a wealth of benefit from publishing, that both the driver data and the model output has produced way more papers than our group would have done on its own. And so I feel like it is a community effort and there's community benefit from it. And all the effort that we put into making that those products available to the community really came back to benefit us because of a wider reach of our initial effort, right? We've seen a lot more impactful papers come out, new ways to look and analyze the model output. So I think that in terms of the science, it's better to be to think about sharing your data products, because I think it furthers the science rather than just keeping it in with your own group. So, but I think and the other thing that a challenge that we have is the metadata, is making sure that you have strong metadata with your data products so that people are using them correctly. So you want, if you're going to put your data out there, you want them to use it correctly, right? You don't want them to misinterpret things. And so making sure that you have clear metadata of what is and is not provided, what the strengths and potential weaknesses of that data product, the uncertainties are, making sure that they're using that data appropriately. And that also comes back to the data policy, because if it's something that's rather new, having a data policy that somewhat forces the users to engage with the creators of the data product can also ensure that those products are being used and interpreted correctly.
Yeah, and to jump on that, even sometimes in my own lab. So I'd say the other side of the challenge is not sometimes the big data, but really and I think this was a point brought up earlier by Amy or others of those really 1 or 2 data points that are super valuable. You know, I operate some field sites where people can come and go, or sometimes undergraduates to come and do some data set. And I have piles of, you know, what we call dark data, right? Stuff in field notebooks, stuff in filing cabinets, stuff in Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, or in data files from software that doesn't exist anymore. And a lot of them, for example, I have Excel spreadsheets of lovely data on like the inventory of species of a forest that I work in. It has no units. I don't know what units they measured the diameter of trees in. And so I have no idea to know. I can guess. But so there's like things like that setting those things ahead of time makes your own life easier too. And especially for these really valuable data points that can help with context or provide a key piece of data you need to really make sense of the data you're collecting now, goes a long way. And it's something now that when we have field campaigns and collect data, you know, we're setting out ahead of time, you know, what's the data we need to collect, what are the units, what are the formats, so that, you know, when I send a student out into the field, they're not just collecting data however they feel like it, and which makes for a lot of complications down the road. And it's something we're still trying to work with. Occasionally it can lead to data recovery, right? So broadly, this is called long tail data, right? The data that's way out in statistical distribution of difficult small data sets, and dark data, right? Data that is not easily recovered by electronic means. But sometimes, for example, a lot of our sites, we've collected tree water use data through something called sap flux measurements. These are done in all sorts of different ways, and usually the data is solely recorded in millivolts or temperatures. So to convert those to actual water flow rates requires a whole bunch of calibrations. But recently there was an effort to synthesize globally, and the incentive behind that was both a benefit to the science, but also publication coming out of it, of just putting all those data together. It provided me the incentive to then hire an undergraduate for the summer to just go through the years of data we collected, figure out the units, go find the initial investigators and pester them, email them, call them, whatever, to find what is it that we need to be able to recover this data. And the outcome of that is a really nice global data set that anybody can use, that's harmonized, that is unit, you know, and same format for each of the sites. And so, you know, there can be lots of wins sometimes in what sounds like a very mundane task.
Thanks, Ankur. Mike, same question.
Okay, I have kind of really a couple of main themes there. A lot of my work's been involved with using satellite data and data from major ground-based systems, but observing the upper atmosphere or the magnetic field. And those tend to be pretty well archived. So that, you know, agencies like NASA and ESA have very substantial archiving programs that have been going on for now 30 years or more with NASA, and certainly ESA for about 20 years. So that is well covered, and you know, I've even had involvement in some of those programs in the past, and some of my colleagues are very involved there. So I don't think there are big problems there. We just need to make sure people cite the repositories and point at essentially the right URLs. It's similar for the ground-based systems. There aren't that many things that are obscure, maybe occasionally, but most of those that you'll either have networks, global networks of instruments, similar instruments, so they'll have either a central repository or at least online repositories at each site, or some mixture. But the thing that I've been very much involved in is looking at extreme events and therefore digging into historical data. And there I'm finding with some of my work, basically you're just citing the papers in which you'll find the data. And a lot of those, I'm delighted to say, are now online. The NASA ADS system has done an awful lot of work there, the astronomical data system. Some national libraries have got systems online. And there's a journal called Terrestrial Magnetism and Atmospheric Electricity that I found very useful, which some of you will recognize by its modern name of JGR. But it's been going over 100 years now, so there is some data from 1921 that I've made extensive use of. But there you just say the data's in the papers are in the reference list, but you can provide DOIs for paper. I think the oldest paper for DOI I've used is about 1716, so which is quite fun. Paper published by the Royal Society here in the UK. What else to add? I think there are issues about trying to use some old data. What do you do, for instance, where somebody has used old drawings, and how do you cite that and the sources? For instance, there was a giant space weather event in 1770 where the really big thing is there's some wonderful drawings taken in Kyoto at the height of the storm. And I can't quite remember how we solved that, but you just got to say these are in the library in Kyoto, and if you really want to, you've got to find the source, you're going to have to go there. But it's only like, there's some of mine is citing an obscure Swedish report from 1925, written in French, but it's sitting in a library in Oxford just up the road from me. So I spent a wonderful day reading that, but I cite the report in the paper. Occasionally you have things that, you have reports that have not been properly published, and you just have to say that this is in an unpublished report and try and get that information into the scientific domain by mentioning it. For instance, we have reports, information on when certain faults happened back in 1989, and we've now, some of that you can just say this is where it happened, and it's in an unsourced report, in a report from an organization that no longer exists. Can't do much more with that. Well, some things I can put in private communication because that's something I experienced back in 1989.
Great. So we have about 8 minutes left, and we've talked in this conversation about why we should make data available. We talked about how to make data available. We talked about some of the challenges in making data available. I want to do like a lightning round on what is missing. We have our policy in place, and you all are kind of enforcing the policy with the authors to make sure that these statements are in the papers. What is missing in what we're asking authors to do, what authors are doing that can contribute to, I guess, as Ankur called it, this beautiful picture where everything is harmoniously connected, so we have a better understanding of the science and the research. Are we missing things? Is there something else? And I know Shelley and we've had discussions about those, what we're going to work on next. So Shelley, I may come to you last since you're here. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as editors and frontline on the research, what we're missing or what's next. And Debbie, I'd like to start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in terms of, I'll say what authors, because I think one of the questions is like, what are the things that I keep going back to authors with requests about? And I think as people get familiar with kind of these data requirements with publications, we're seeing less and less issues with authors, but typically when it comes to papers that we're handling as editors, the issues that we see are either a completely missing data statement, there's no data statement whatsoever, or the links don't work to the data, or they go to a general site that's not really, we'd have to go start hunting for it, or it's a site in another language, so not English. And so I think those are some of the issues that we see more often with data statements from authors. In terms of, AGU and its data policies, I think things are going pretty well. I think just making it clear to authors when they're submitting their manuscripts that this is required, and if it's not included, the paper won't be reviewed, at least if they're not attempting to address their data statement and archive their data at the time their paper is submitted, that it won't be reviewed, peer reviewed, because we're also seeing that reviewers are asking, pointing it out. If if the data statement is insufficient, or the links that are provided are broken or not working, we'll oftentimes have reviewers tell us, I've tried this, I can't access data. So I don't know if I completely answered the question, but in terms of, I feel like we're in the right track, we're moving in the right direction. And so I don't have any big like missing what are gaps right now. It's more on making sure that all the authors are on board.
Great. Mike?
To me, I think it's just remember the human element. You've got to engage the authors and look at their individual case and be trying to be persuasive. And also in that, remembering that policy is not a rigid set of rules. That's the clues in the word. A policy is something there to guide us in our work, both the the reviewers, the authors, and the editors, and in that spirit, and find a way forward out of that. I think there's much more I can say. That some people will be resistant, need more pushing. Some people will just need a careful form of words to get them on board. Some people will totally ignore everything the reviewers and the editors say, and their paper probably gets rejected at that point.
Great. Olga?
It's probably not exactly the answer to your question, what's missing, but actually is the compilation of all links to references relevant to AGU data policy on the AGU website. And the simple reason being they are slightly scattered around AGU publications, data policy, and everything. And my highest rejection rate exactly on data, it's when people submit first, and then I have to scroll, and actually I've already created my own list that I just copy and paste in the rejection decisions, that people can see how it all fits together. Because the usual or the most typical scenario that I think what's happening, an author or it's an corresponding author is trying to submit the manuscript. They're extremely tired and exhausted after like all this writing the manuscript, fighting with their co-authors, and they now also have to do something about data. And they have to say something. They are not prepared because they haven't thought ahead about that. And then they receive a rejection letter from me pretty much immediately because the data, either the statement was missing or the link was missing or anything. And they go like completely upset and because of the whole situation. So having everything in one place before they hit the submit button, that would be extremely helpful in terms of reducing this stress and the this communication with the rejections, which are not exactly the rejections, it's just because the submission isn't complete.
Great, thank you. Olga. Ankur?
So I'll look at this from the other side, which is I agree with the points that I think AGU has taken a lot of leadership in the journal in publishing industry on data. And the one that I think maybe there's more to do on is the first letter in FAIRS, the F, finding data, right? And so we've made this great stride in having every paper on AGU journals have data statements and links to repositories. And I know we're moving to the point where the data statement will now be on the article info page as opposed to just buried in the acknowledgements. But it's still pretty difficult to find papers with data, right? And maybe we'll say it's not the job of journals to do that, it's the job of repositories, but I think AGU has an opportunity to be a leader in a journal where it would be very easy to say, I want to search only data statements for the following words or things like that. I think it would allow things like meta-analyses and syntheses to be able to be much more effective and could be something that AGU could potentially have a lot of leadership on. So it's an idea I'm throwing out there, something that I think maybe we could go into.
Great, thanks, Ankur. And Amy, I know you're here. Would you like to weigh in really quickly?
I guess this is really a conversation for you know, a whole other set of meetings. But I'd like to make just the observation that, as you know, Randy, we've had conversations recently about how would it be possible to make open data policies compatible with double masked peer review. And if any AGU journals were to move to a double masked review model, even on a pilot basis, how would this work? And that the idea of asking authors to make their data available at the time of review seems almost incompatible with having the authors be anonymous to the reviewers. So we don't have answers for this right now, especially for certain repositories. It seems to be almost undoable. But I just wanted to bring that out there as another sort of conversation that's going to be really interesting to follow in the next few years. It's one of those other sort of paradigm shifts that I think publishing is going through right now, is how do we solve all of these community needs?
Thanks, Amy. And Shelley, to wrap things up, would you like to add anything?
Really excited to see the support that's coming from our editors, sharing it with our researchers. I just popped into the chat. There's town halls coming up. In 7 hours, we have one specifically on software citation. I invite you all to come if you want to discuss that. There's new guidance that's come out that aligns, because we were on the team developing the guidance, it aligns with what we're already doing at AGU. And then all of the challenges around data citation that still do exist. We've hit on some here. There are more. And we're really trying to dig in on that, and also how to find a repository. That's hard. If you don't have a repository home and you're stuck with a general repository and not getting support for metadata, that's a hard problem that you're in. And the community is trying to help with that. So that's how I would wrap up.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you to the panelists, Mike, Ankur, Olga, Amy, also for joining us. I think I got everybody here. Thank you also to Brooks for joining and contributing to the chat. And then thank you for the AGU staff. Please enjoy the remainder of fall meeting, and thank you again for joining us for this panel.